The US women's national team has been knocked out in the round of 16 by Sweden at the Women's World Cup. So let's talk about it. The earliest exit for a US women's national team at a World Cup. If you don't know, the US women's national team has basically podiumed every single World Cup since the inaugural World Cup. Seeing them on the podium is quite a regular and familiar scene. However, this time we are reckoning with a round of 16 exit after a very, very dramatic shootout with Sweden. VAR had to be brought in, and if you were able to see the VAR between the ball and the line of the goal, I mean, it is basically the thinnest of margins that thin margins can come down to. It is... I don't know if I've ever seen a closer VAR than this in the women's or the men's game or ever before. It was intense. It was dramatic. The way the course of the penalty shootouts went, the way they were missed, the players that missed. I mean, watching this as a neutral at 7 a.m., I was extremely stressed. So I can only imagine what a Swedish or a US fan was like watching this. Like, they probably lived and died a few times as they were watching it. But the main topic here is the US getting knocked out. Certainly not a familiar situation that a lot of these players have been in, and I think there's a lot of pondering questions around what's next and what led to this. I'll have another episode dedicated to Sweden as I preview their quarterfinals with Japan with a special guest, which you'll have to stay tuned and find out. So for today, I'm just focusing on the US, what this loss means for the US women's national team, and just the overall era shift that we are seeing this World Cup as a whole. Going into this World Cup, there was a noticeable shift in personnel on the team compared to the 2019-2015 World Cup. There's obviously a lot of veterans that have been kind of pushed out a little bit, with the likes of Tobin Heath, Kristen Press, even Becky Sauerbrunn unfortunately being ruled out. So there was a lot of prominent faces that you were not going to see. Obviously the big name of Sam Ewis, her sister was in it, which was great. We'll talk about Christy in a moment. But in a general sense, it was known that this was going to be an era shift, specifically coming in with a head coach of Vlatko. And after the disappointing Olympics for them, which by the way they got bronze in, so as disappointing as we can say it is, in some ways they still podiumed and got a medal, but for US standards that is disappointing. And after that Olympics, it was kind of like, we're seeing this US era kind of come to an end, and now this World Cup exit has happened. You can certainly nail the coffin in and say, right, that dominance, that scary dominance that teams would be freaked out to go against the US, maybe isn't there anymore. And obviously we saw the results this year. We saw the World Cup. You had the Olympics in mind. That's kind of a little bit more evidence as to why they're not so feared, because in some ways they've been proven to be beatable. Every team is beatable, every nation is beatable, every squad is beatable, but for the US women's national team, their heavy and dominant reign and era, in some ways you could say they were actually not beatable. Teams tried and failed, and teams tried on the biggest stage and also failed. And I think back to the 2019, they had that game against Spain where you saw them be a little bit shaky, and it could be like, oh, could this be it? But in US fashion, they just go out and win it, and that's what they did. Understandably, Vlatko was not let go easier, but certainly the fact that the Olympics was his first major tournament with the team, it was COVID, they had a pretty sloppy road. They obviously lost that 3-0 to Sweden at the start, and then got knocked out by Canada, and, you know, it was an up and down, but it was like, right, we're seeing some of these veterans go out. Vlatko's coming in, he's got this massive role of, right, integrating these young players, and you know what, we'll just look forward to the World Cup, and that's when they can really pick. Fixtures went on, players called up, players not called up, kind of rotating a starting 11. I still don't think Vlatko is actually still aware of what a proper starting 11 for him looks like, given there's injuries of obviously like Macario, but even Macario at the Olympics, she got like about 10 minutes really, which is crazy to think about, which is a consistent issue that in my eyes was his downfall this World Cup. Not trusting his players, not trusting his bench, and not trusting that proven talent, right? Katrina Macario is proven talent. Sofia Huerta is proven talent. Christy Mewis is proven kind of pivotal experience. And so when you're not relying on those players either in the Olympics or the World Cup, there's questions to be asked. And obviously we'll dive into the substitutions in a little bit, but that is a concern that Vlatko hasn't necessarily been able to fix, because maybe he doesn't see it as a problem. Kicking off the World Cup on quest for that third consecutive World Cup, they kicked things off against Vietnam. It was a pretty decent start. I mean, Sophia Smith was on fire. Sure, there was a fair amount of missed opportunities, but in some ways that midfield really wasn't tested defensively, nor was the backline. They then faced the Dutch. That first half, certainly not how the US national team wants to play. In the second half, they did fix a few things. However, there was questions of why was there no substitutions? Or why was there no certain substitutions of the likes of Lynn Williams coming in? And in a game against the Dutch where absolutely momentum is going your way and absolutely you were knocking on that door, but sometimes knocking on the door is not enough. Sometimes you need to just full on kick that door open to get a goal in. And I think this is something that maybe there's a standard of differentiation between the US Women's National Team and Vlatko, because Vlatko is happy to just be knocking on the door, and he said that in his post-game press conference. He didn't want to make those substitutions because he felt like they were knocking on the door and those substitutions can come in and it's going to take them a few minutes to adjust. Didn't want to interrupt the momentum. Two major problems with that. Number one, knocking on the door is not enough. When you see your front line and the striker position and the wingers, whoever it is that's able to make that progression, and those patterns are in a way still knocking on the door, not breaking open the door, you want to reinforce fresh legs. You want to reinforce different minds. You want to enforce different creativity that the Dutch hadn't dealt with in the past 80 minutes. And to say that you're afraid the likes of Lynn Williams will take a few minutes to adjust, that to me comes off as a scared manager that doesn't trust his bench, which is super frustrating because the US, in my eyes, has one of the deepest benches out of any nation. But if that bench isn't used and if that manager doesn't trust his bench, what's the point of the bench? If he just simply wants to stick with his starting 11 and those 11 players that he decided to put out, what is the point of the bench if they're just sitting there waiting when he doesn't trust them? Extremely problematic, and in some ways that was really his downfall this World Cup. They take the draw, they settle for a point against the Dutch. He seemed to be quite happy with the points. You know, it wasn't a loss and we didn't drop all the points. But then you listen to the players and the players are like, yeah, this is not good enough. Like, as reigning champions, we need to be scoring more goals, we need to be a little bit more creative, and we need to be taking those 3 points in the group stages. And so again, just simply from these comments, you see the players are kind of on a different page than what he's in. He's satisfied with the performance that maybe they're not. And sure, players are slightly a little bit more critical than themselves, and a head coach is always critical of his players, but there's a difference of maybe who wants it more, or there's a difference of what is good enough. And again, we're talking about standard. US Women's National Team is all about the highest and the best standard of the game. Like, regardless of what competition they're in, regardless of who's on the pitch, it's all about high standard. Regardless, certain tests, certain challenges, they take all those lessons and move on to the Portugal game. Arguably the worst game that they have played under Vlatko. They were very, very lucky not to get knocked out because Portugal hit the post in the last 2 shots of the game. Portugal had eaten them left and right in that midfield. It looked like at some points even Portugal had like 2 or 3 extra players on the pitch when they didn't. They had them figured out in terms of possession, off possession, and movement overall from the US Women's National Team looked way too lackluster. And it just was not enough at all. And it was very concerning that, yeah, they still were not able to put a barrage of goals. And in some ways, this is not to be disrespectful to Portugal, because I think Portugal had an incredible game. They had a game plan, executed it perfectly. Everybody who came on the pitch, substituted or starting 11, did their job, did their duty, and they were, I mean, literally this close to making it through. But for Vlatko, there's questions of why is he not making substitutions and why is he not making the right substitutions? When you're front 3, and I think Trinity Rodman, Sophia Smith are coming in on pretty good form, especially Sophia Smith. I mean, she could have made a run for the Golden Boot. When your players that produce are not producing, we need to switch things up. There's a question of why. Why are they not getting that service? What is restricting them? Am I able to make a tactical change? And that stubbornness and tactical work and being able to put a plan B, and maybe that just he didn't have the trust in his players to switch things around, was apparent once more. And it's like, right, we just drew with the Dutch. Sure, you know, they're tougher competition than Portugal, but against Portugal, I mean, it was an abysmal performance from them. There's no other way to say it. Being matched up against Sweden, there was going to be questions of, right, who's going to replace Roosevelt because she has racked up 2 yellow cards, won't be participating. And thankfully, Vlatko was able to make a change. He went up with a 4-2-3-1 formation and put Emily Sonnet in the midfield. Doesn't usually play in the midfield, not for the international system at all, actually. You know, has played there a few times for Ola Reign this season. You had Sullivan as her other pivot in the middle. Behind them were Naomi Girma, who, man, is she the future of that US Men's National Team? She's been flawless. I mean, absolutely flawless. It's been such a joy to watch her, and I think pairing her up with Ertz, it was just so fun to watch, because it's like, sure, Ertz is probably on her way out, but then you've also got this bright, young talent, modern center back of Girma that basically is always flawless. On the ball, off the ball, defending, closing down pockets, anything. And so, you know, I think there was a lot of negatives that happened on the pitch for the US, but there was also a lot of positives with the likes of, again, Ertz and Girma probably putting in stats and numbers that are one of the best this competition so far. Sonnet and Sullivan as the pivots worked up so well, and it's kind of disappointing the US probably put up their best starting 11 in terms of adaptability, and I'd go as far as to say that this is probably their best performance under Vlatko. But again, it was the fact that you brought in Megan Rapinoe when the last 2 games she hasn't been on form, but then you had a substitution of Megan Rapinoe come on, which listen, I love Megan Rapinoe and I'll very much praise her at the end of this video, but the last 2 games, she hasn't been as effectful and as productive as you want her to be. And obviously, she's not as creative and not giving you that creativity. And there's a lack of issues of producing. And so going stubborn with her over and over again shows being scared and not trusting your young players. And then the next window of substitutions comes in the 119th minute before the penalty shootouts take off. You bring in Kristie Mewis and Kelly O'Hara. Why wasn't Kelly O'Hara brought in probably 20 minutes earlier? Why wasn't Kristie Mewis brought in probably 30 minutes earlier? There's decisions of choosing your vets correctly and choosing your youngsters correctly. And I'm not sure if Megan Rapinoe was the correct vet to bring on at that moment. In contrast, I think Kelly O'Hara was probably the veteran you wanted to bring on, but certainly not in the 119th minute. They were knocking on that door. I mean, they were this close to scoring. And let's talk about Musovic for Sweden, because if it had not been for Musovic, the US would have gone through. Like, there's no conversation about that. Like I mentioned, this was the best performance that the US was able to put in under Vlatko. Absolutely. They needed to go that extra gear, go that extra push, that extra millimeter of breaking it down. You know, you're not just knocking on the door, you're breaking it down. And I think maybe there's questions of adaptability. Had they been playing with that 4-2-3-1 formation a little bit longer, had they drilled that maybe a few more times during training, could have they found that ball, that back of the net? Questions we'll never answer, we'll never be able to know. But what is known is that the substitutions were not right. The substitutions were not the right ones. The substitutions were not made at the right time. And, 2 out of your 3 substitutions missed the penalties. And I think, again, this is going to sound very, very harsh, but I'm not sure why you would give Megan Rapinoe the penalty when you just saw some of her set pieces were not how they should have been. You just see some of her corner deliveries not how they should have been. Again, I understand Megan Rapinoe hasn't missed a penalty ever, and it's easy to criticize after the fact, but seeing how that game had went on, seeing how her last 10 minutes just went on, I'm not sure if I'd give her that crucial penalty. Again, I'm not Vlatko, and I'm not under that stressful situation. It's really hard to say, and it's extremely easy to criticize after she missed that penalty. But you kind of brought her on for the penalties, and that's what happens after seeing some of her deliveries and set pieces. Kelly O'Hara just unlucky to miss and hit the post. However, I'm very happy for Kristie Mewis. I mean, she touched the ball once this entire World Cup. First ever World Cup for Mewis, and it was a goal. So in some ways, you have to give it up to Mewis because it has been a very, very long road for her to make it into the squad. I mean, she's busted her ass, I will say it just as, to get here. And I'm very happy to see her make it, and I'm very happy to see that positive one touch that she had on the ball actually make it to the back of the net. But it's the thin margins. They had absolutely beaten Sweden in that second half and onwards. They had absolutely eaten that midfield, and they didn't allow Sweden to have their first shot goal until the 85th minute. So again, this was probably the best US performance, but it's those thin margins. When you go the extra mile, your substitutions need to be spawn. Giving credit where credit is due, Musovic absolutely carried Sweden, like 100%. And there's no reason to sugarcoat it. There's a lot of games where you see like, oh, Karabalch absolutely carried England, or like Bon Mati absolutely carried Spain. Like we give a lot of that props sometimes to the outfield players. And I think it's just as fair to be giving it to the goalkeepers, because she made some saves that I'm like, how on earth? It's like a simulator save. So low, so powerful, she's making it. So unpredictable header, like looping in such a weird angle. She got it. Like, Musovic, what a freaking game. Like, you gotta give it up to her. Sometimes you gotta have a little bit of luck on your side, and that luck was just not meant to be with the US. It was certainly with the Swedes. But then again, if they had pushed a little bit harder, if they had played that Portugal game a little bit better, they could have topped the group, and they could have had not easier opposition, but they would have not had Sweden. They would have had South Africa, which a team on paper, the odds, they would have won. Hate the US Women's National Team or love them, hate the players or love them. And again, this is coming from a Canadian here, but you have to appreciate what an era this has been over the last I mean, specifically 8 years in recent modern history, they set the standard on the field, especially on the biggest stages of the World Cup. It's always been give your best and do your best. And they've delivered when they've done that, absolutely. Off the field, they've made it quite clear to their own federation and other federations where the game should be and where the investment part should be. Every single national team that has an equal pay agreement or currently fighting one absolutely fought that equal pay agreement on their own. But somebody had to get the ball going and somebody had to get that ball rolling. And it's hard to deny that Megan Rapinoe, for example, and the US Women's National Team, what they've done and the far races they've taken to get to this point and to have the sport get to this point, it's hard to not give them that credit. Again, love Rapinoe, hate Rapinoe, enjoy her shit talking, her celebrations, but she is a person that has been game changing. She's a legend of this era, like it or not. She's given us some worldies in this World Cup. It's disappointing to see her leave in the way that she's leaving, especially after a missed penalty, similar with Alex Morgan. I think she'll probably have another World Cup in her, but this was not her best World Cup. And again, she set the standards for so many strikers and has been such an intelligent and fun player to watch since the get-go, where now it's an end of an era. Football is a brutal sport that loves to write stories. Some of these stories are filled with thrill, others are filled with agony and tears and frustration and sadness, but that's the World Cup. Everything is made down to the wire. It's the razor thin margins. It's who is able to execute it better on their best day, who is able to be the better team on that better day. This is an era change. It's a shift change. This World Cup was meant to be exactly that, and the World Cup is World Cupping in the most World Cup fashion. The talent has always been there from the opposition, but the funding has never been there until now. It's starting to roll in, and so when that funding is starting to roll in and you're seeing that talent on the pitch tactically and just the overall game plans and just how good players are is getting challenged. Depth, potential, stars, youngsters, veterans, all of that is just not good enough these days. It's not good enough this World Cup. You need to have it down tactically. You need to have head coaches that are extremely adaptable, that trust their players. The game is evolving. It's getting much, much harder to be dominating. And I feel like for the next few World Cups, it will be shocks after shock. You will not know who is going to win the World Cup, which is great. It's fantastic. This is what the sport has wanted. This is what the sport has needed. So absolutely, it's upsetting to see a dominant force like that of the US fall down in the fashion that they have fallen under the reign of Vlatko, but it's meant to happen, and this is how teams fall and are able to regroup and come back even as a scarier force, which is what all these teams that are falling now are going to come back as. It's going to be better, it's going to be more challenging, and the game only continues to grow that way. As for Vlatko, it's not is he going to leave? It's more so when is that announcement going to come? Winning 4 out of your 10 possible competitive matches out of the Olympics and the World Cup with the US Men's National Team is not good enough. That's only 40%. Again, I've talked about standard. The US Men's National Team is the highest of levels of standards, and that is just not good enough at all. I don't know if I can suggest somebody who can replace him as of right now. We'll probably have to wait for the conclusion of the World Cup to see who could be available. Casey Stoney is a good shout and her name has been in the mix, but for Vlatko, it just clearly hasn't worked out. He's got a vision, he's got a game plan, and he's got tendencies that maybe just didn't work with his team. And that's okay. Some managers come in, it just doesn't work. They're probably great, talented managers. It just doesn't work with this group of people. We've seen that happen, and again, you see it more exposed now with how good the game has gotten. So for Vlatko, I'm assuming this is the end of the road. Anyways, I'd love to hear your opinion on this. Vlatko, the team, the performances, the overall structure that you saw from them. What does this mean, and kind of how much does this affect the game as a whole in this World Cup? As always, to stay updated and to continue enjoying the beautiful game, make sure you subscribe to me here on YouTube.